I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen.
The state banquet at Aldermere Palace was meant to be a night of polished smiles, glittering protocol, and quiet unity. Every place setting had been measured to the inch. Every guest list had been checked twice. King Edmund had insisted on it. After weeks of private strain within the family, he needed the room to believe they still moved as one. Princess Elena arrived first among the family, taking her seat at the head table with the calm, practiced grace the public had come to expect of her. Beside her, her husband, Crown Prince Alastair, adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the room the way he always did, counting exits, counting faces, counting the small dangers no one else noticed. Across from them sat Queen Consort Margarethi, resplendent in deep emerald silk, and the king himself, composed at the head of the table like a man holding a house together with willpower alone. It was Elena who saw it first. A brooch, pinned just above Margarethi's collarbone. A spray of diamonds shaped like wild broom flowers, small and unassuming to anyone who didn't know its history. But Elena knew. She had spent years learning every piece in the family's private collection, not out of vanity, but out of respect for what each one carried. And this piece carried more than most. It had belonged to Alastair's late mother, Princess Rosalind, a woman the public still spoke of with the particular ache reserved for those taken too soon. Rosalind had worn that brooch on the day she opened the country's first free medical clinic for children. She had worn it at Alastair's christening. She had asked in the quiet, careful way people ask such things when they suspect their time is short, that it never be worn again except by someone who understood what it meant. Elena did not blink. She did not turn away. For a few long seconds she sat perfectly still, as if her whole body had understood the shock before her voice could catch up to it. Across the table, Margarethi felt the stare land on her, sharp, unmistakable, and her fingers rose toward the brooch, almost by instinct, before she caught herself and lowered her hand back to her lap. Alastair noticed the movement first. He looked from his wife to the jewel pinned against his stepmother's gown, and something in his jaw went hard and still. This was not simple ornamentation. This was memory pinned to silk. This was grief placed on public display. A state banquet is not an ordinary dinner. It exists to project unity, dignity, and strength to visiting dignitaries, a performance of a nation's steadiness staged in gold-rimmed china and rehearsed toasts. King Edmund had wanted this evening, of all evenings, to look effortless. He needed the assembled ambassadors to leave believing the crown was solid, unshaken, whole. Elena understood the cost of breaking that rhythm. She had spent a decade learning exactly how much royal ceremony depended on nobody ever saying the true thing out loud. But she also understood in that instant what staying silent would cost. If she said nothing, Rosalind's memory would be quietly swallowed by protocol, the way so many inconvenient truths were swallowed at tables like this one. Beneath the table, Alastair reached for her hand, not to stop her, she would realize later, but to steady her. She felt his fingers close around hers and gently pulled back. That small motion told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't acting from anger. She was acting from grief that had waited a very long time to be spoken. Margarethi looked down at her plate, then up again, and something shifted in her expression. She understood, in that same second, that Elena had recognized the brooch instantly, and that there would be no pretending otherwise. King Edmund saw it too. His careful, practiced composure, the same composure that had carried the family through scandal after scandal, began, for the first time that evening, to crack at the edges. The room kept breathing, but only barely. Elena rose from her chair, and the polite murmur of the banquet hall thinned into something dangerous. Servers paused mid-step. Guests at the far tables turned to look toward the head of the room, sensing without knowing why that something had gone wrong. Alastair stood half a second after his wife, close enough to show his support, far enough back to let her speak for herself. Then, Elena did the one thing no one at that table expected. She asked quietly but unmistakably for the service to stop. Margarethi froze. Edmund looked from Elena to his wife, and in that look was the sudden, sinking understanding that the damage was already done, that no amount of smoothing over would undo what half the room had just witnessed. This was no small breach of etiquette. This was Rosalind's shadow, returning through the one object no one should have used carelessly. In that frozen room, the brooch did not mean the same thing to everyone who looked at it. To Margaretti, it had meant something like reconciliation, a public gesture that said the old grief between generations had finally softened into peace. She had believed, or told herself she believed, that wearing it would say, "I am not trying to replace her. I am only trying to honor her." To King Edmund, it was a far more dangerous thing, a reminder of a marriage and a loss he had never fully made peace with, resurfacing at the worst possible moment, in front of people whose good opinion the kingdom needed. To Alistair, it was his mother's shadow, returning unannounced at a table full of strangers. And to Elena, it was a boundary crossed in public, beneath chandeliers, before the eyes of the world. She held herself still, but the pain had already reached her face. She had spent years honoring Rosalind's memory carefully. Visiting the clinic Rosalind had founded on the anniversary of its opening, keeping certain rooms in the family's private residence exactly as Rosalind had left them, teaching her own children small things about the grandmother they had never met. She had never once turned that memory into a performance. That was precisely why this moment cut so deep. Rosalind was not simply a name from the past. She was the woman whose absence had shaped Alistair's caution, his silence in certain rooms, the fierce and quiet way he protected the people he loved. Elena had learned to read those silences over the years. She understood what they cost him. The whisper that finally explained everything came from Lady Sophia Vane, Elena's oldest friend and closest confidant within the palace walls, who leaned toward her during the frozen silence and murmured that this was not the first time the brooch had caused alarm. Elena said nothing, but her eyes changed, and Alistair, watching from beside her, saw it happen. That single whisper pulled the entire story backward to a private family meeting 3 weeks earlier at Thornfield House, the family's countryside residence, chosen deliberately for its distance from prying cameras. The gathering had been small and quiet, called to review Rosalind's personal effects ahead of a planned public memorial exhibition, the first of its kind, meant to let the public see, up close, the woman behind the crown's carefully managed image. Alistair had entered that meeting already tense. Anything connected to his mother was never simply history to him. It was childhood. It was loss. It was the wound sitting just beneath the practiced calm he wore in public. Elena had asked for one thing only that day, that the brooch remain untouched, kept exactly as it was, until Alistair personally decided what role, if any, it should play in his mother's public legacy. But during that same quiet meeting, Margaretti had made a request that would, weeks later, become a fault line running straight through the family. According to what Sophia had later learned through a trusted member of the household staff, Margaretti had approached King Edmund privately that same evening and asked whether she might wear the brooch at the upcoming state banquet, as a gesture of unity between the family's past and its present. She believed, sincerely it seemed, that the gesture would show the country, and perhaps show herself, that old divisions had finally settled into something like peace. Elena saw the request very differently. To her, unity could not be manufactured by borrowing another woman's grief and pinning it proudly to a gown for an audience of foreign dignitaries. Unity, if it existed at all, had to be built slowly and quietly and with permission. Alistair had spoken to his father that same evening. He told the king plainly that the brooch should remain unworn until he personally decided its place in his mother's legacy. Edmund had listened, but he had not promised anything. That silence wounded Elena more than an outright refusal would have. She understood palace hesitation. She understood the careful, non-committal language that senior royals used to avoid taking sides. But this felt different. The king knew exactly how sensitive that object was, and he had left the door open anyway. Elena learned of Margaretti's request through Sophia days later, and the news unsettled her. Not because Margaretti wanted dignity or acceptance, which was understandable enough, but because it seemed she was willing to borrow that dignity from a woman who could no longer object. Alistair had left that discussion visibly shaken, and Elena had watched him carry the weight of it in silence for 3 weeks, without complaint, the way he carried most things that hurt him. That was why the banquet became unbearable. The moment she saw the brooch on Margaretti's gown, Elena understood immediately that the private warning had gone unheeded. Edmund had stayed silent when it mattered. Margaretti had gone ahead regardless. And Alistair had been forced to confront his mother's memory in the worst possible setting, a room full of cameras and diplomats, with no way to step outside and simply grieve. So when Elena rose from her chair, it was not impulse. It was the memory of a promise that had quietly, carelessly, been broken. The room did not erupt. It froze. Elena did not shout. She did not tremble. She simply looked across the table at Margaretti and asked one question that cut cleanly through every title, every rank, every practiced smile in the room. "Why are you wearing it?" The words were quiet. They landed like a verdict anyway. Margaretti tried to answer with royal composure intact. She lifted her chin, met Elena's gaze, and began to explain that the brooch was simply part of her evening's ensemble, nothing more. But her voice tightened halfway through the sentence, and everyone at the table who understood the jewel's real history heard the crack in it. The visiting guests did not grasp the full weight of what was unfolding, but the people who mattered did. Elena knew, Alistair knew, Edmund knew, and that shared, silent knowledge made Margaretti's composure feel suddenly thin. Alistair rose slowly beside his wife. He did not speak over her, and he made no attempt to soften what she had said. He simply stood close enough that the room understood she was not standing alone. King Edmund leaned toward Margaretti and told her, quietly but firmly, to remove it. She hesitated, one breath, one pause. But that single pause changed the temperature of the entire room. Elena saw it, and her grief sharpened briefly into disbelief. Alistair saw it, and his jaw locked. Edmund saw it too, and in his face the hesitation had already begun to look, unfairly or not, like defiance.
Margaretti finally reached for the clasp, but the damage had already spread through the hall like a draft through an open door. Her hand shook slightly as she unpinned it, a small, private tremor that said more than any apology could have. Princess Augusta, the king's formidable elder sister, crossed the room and spoke to her brother in a low, cold voice that only those nearest could hear. This was no longer about a piece of jewelry, she told him. This was about judgment. Once Augusta named the real issue, the family stopped treating the evening as an unfortunate incident and began treating it as something closer to a crisis of trust. In the hours after the banquet quietly, carefully resumed, for the sake of the visiting delegation, if nothing else, the real conversation happened far from the cameras. Edmund ordered a full review of how the brooch had left the family's private archive in the first place, who had approved its use, who had signed it out, who had known and said nothing. The question was no longer simply why Margaretti had worn it. It was who had allowed it to happen at all. Elena, for her part, did not ask for another briefing or another carefully worded palace explanation. She asked instead to speak with Margaretti privately. No aides, no advisors. No one left in the room to turn grief into procedure. What passed between them in that private sitting room was never released to the public, and never will be. But those closest to the family understood that Margaretti removed the brooch from her collection entirely afterward, and that a new, quiet rule was put in place. Nothing belonging to Rosalind would be worn again without Alistair's direct agreement. By morning, of course, none of the discretion mattered. A photograph from the banquet, Margaretti in diamonds, Elena standing at the table, Alistair's face carved into restraint, had already reached every front page in the country. The public did not need an official explanation to understand what they were looking at. They saw a woman defending a memory the nation still quietly carried, in a room that had expected her to stay seated and smile. The banquet ended. Its meaning did not fade. It became, in the family's private memory if nowhere else, the night Princess Elena proved that loyalty to a crown does not require silence. It requires knowing precisely when dignity has been crossed, and having the composure to say so without raising your voice. Margaretti learned, slowly and painfully, that acceptance cannot be taken from someone else's grief, no matter how sincerely intended. King Edmund learned that old wounds cannot be managed through careful timing and careful language alone, that some things demand to be dealt with honestly, or not at all. And Alistair watched his wife become, in that one unplanned moment, something more than a future consort. He watched her become the person willing to stand between his mother's memory and anyone who might, even with good intentions, use it carelessly. Elena never asked for credit for what she'd done. She asked for one thing only, that it never happen again. And in a family built almost entirely on the careful management of appearances, that one quiet, unglamorous request may have been the most honest thing said at Aldermere Palace in years.